On behalf of the University of California, thank you for tuning in today to our UC Alumni Career Network webinar. My name is Cynthia Chase, and I am the principal and founder of Synthesis Consulting. I'm a social worker, licensed therapist, college faculty, former peace officer, nonprofit executive director, and mayor who is passionate about public policy, advancing community wellness, and helping underrepresented people get into elected office. I am also a very proud UC Santa Cruz alumna, go Slugs, and I am honored to be moderating today's webinar. This program is part of a UC-wide effort to unite and support alumni across our 10 campuses. We aim to equip you with the information, insights, and connections necessary to launch, grow, or expand your career. Throughout today's session, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our speaker by clicking the Q&A button on your screen, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible during the event. Our discussion today is focused on careers in government, policy, and public service. Our panel will share personal experiences and insights along with tangible tips and advice to help you pivot into the public sector or gain insights to advance and grow your career within the field. When I chose to run for office, a key element that motivated me was the experience I had as a social worker. I worked for 2 decades to advance criminal and juvenile legal system reform and often found a significant gap between well-intended policy and the unintended consequences those policies had once they were implemented. Today's topic is important to me because we need more skilled, intelligent, critical thinkers engaged in public policy to reduce those unintended consequences and to create more just, equitable, and thriving communities. I'm joined today by 3 inspiring UC alumni. Edgar Castelan is a current district representative for State Senator Connie Leyva, representing her in varying aspects to the public, but specifically focuses on policy matters relating to environmental justice, transportation, and immigration, as well as handling constituent case services in her district. He was also just recently elected as a board member of the Jurupa Area Recreation and Park District, helping direct policy as it relates to open green spaces, facilities, and adult and youth recreational activities in the city of Jurupa Valley. Edgar is an alumnus of UC Riverside, graduating with a BA in Political Science, Administrative Studies in 2015, and a Master in Public Policy in 2018. Erik Infelise is a special agent with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in the Office of Inspector General, Office of Investigations. His primary focus is investigating healthcare fraud. In addition to investigative duties, Erik is the lead firearms instructor for the region and frequently serves on the protection detail for HHS Secretary Javier Becerra. He is a 1999 alumnus of UC Davis. And finally, Shannon Shellenberg, a deputy director in the Office of International Relations in the California State Senate. In this role, she has welcomed thousands of officials from more than 130 countries to the California State Capitol, coordinating their meetings and activities. She also has acted as lead staff on California Senate trips to countries as diverse as Egypt, Iceland, and Vietnam, charged with program development and implementation, as well as all logistics and protocol. Shannon is an alumna of the National Conference of State Legislatures 2008 Legislative Staff Management Institute, the U.S. Department's 2011 Legislative Fellows Program to Russia, and the 2014 class of the California Issues and Trends Program of Leadership California. She's a 1994 UC Davis alumna, graduating Phi Beta Kappa with majors in international relations and French. Edgar, Erik, and Shannon, thank you so much for being part of today's webinar. And without further ado, let's dive into our first question. So I want to start our conversation off by asking each panelist to briefly describe their post-UC career journey and your current role. And we'll start with Edgar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here and inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to our fellow UC alumni. So my post-UC career started at UCR in my last year in 2015. For those of you who know Professor Leverage, I did an internship course with him. And through there being placed with Assembly Member Jose Medina If you're familiar with the assembly, Assembly member Sabrina Cervantes was his district director at the time, and so she was my supervisor. So so I was under her tutelage. So that's where I began my legislative experience, interning within that office. Shortly after graduating, I worked at the Registrar of Voters for Riverside County, working in the 2016 presidential election, which is a very interesting experience. Dealing with inventory, programming some of the voting machines. If when you go vote in person, if you have experience with that, that's kind of some of the things that I dealt with within that agency. Shortly after, I went back to do my master's at UCR to do my master's in public policy. The program actually helped me secure a fellowship with Western Riverside County of Governments, being placed in the city of Banning. And there I got a different experience working at the city planning department as well. So dealing with government codes. I kind of helped start off their downtown revitalization project there. I have all these layers of experience dealing with cities and states. Before coming to my current role with Senator Connie Leyva, one of our field representatives in San Bernardino County, covering cities, if you're familiar with Inland Empire and Bloomington, Grand Terrace, Muscoy. So I deal with, as mentioned, matters dealing with environmental justice, transportation, immigration, also constituent services as well, helping people, all issues that they have with any state agency, whether it's EDD, DMV, Franchise Tax Board, any state agency that you can think of. So I deal less with a specific policy matter, and I'm more of an intermediary between the public and our capital staff. So that's kind of my journey and my current role.
Thanks so much, Edgar. And Erik, you're up next.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and serve on the panel. My career path began while I was still at UC Davis. Between my third and fourth year, I interned at the State Department in Washington, D.C., which was a great experience. And then in my final quarter there at Davis, I began the process of applying for federal positions, knowing that it takes a long time. I think I started the process about 5 to 6 months ahead of my graduation. My last quarter there, I started a paid internship with a defense contracting company. And a few months after graduating, I got a job offer from the Department of Defense. I jumped at the opportunity to join DoD, where I had a chance to be a civilian general investigator. I worked there for about 5 years. Eventually, I knew that I wanted to get into federal law enforcement. And so I applied for and was hired by my current agency, Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. And as was mentioned in my bio, I focus primarily on healthcare fraud investigations, grant fraud investigations, and I also serve as a firearms instructor for my fellow law enforcement officers. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. And Shannon, you're next.
Hi, great. Thank you, Cynthia, and thanks to the UC Alumni Career Network for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity. I can actually sum up my career path fairly quickly because I've worked for the same office for the last 23 years. However, there has been some notable things for me along the way, and I'm sensing a theme here. I actually did an internship in the office that I currently work in when I was at UC Davis, and I heard internship from Erik and Edgar as well. So that's definitely a plug for internships and the networking opportunities that they give you. After I graduated from UC, I worked in the hospitality industry for several years, working for high-end hotels. And while at the time I wasn't sure about the experience that it was giving me, I've really found that transitioning into working for the legislature, all the people skills and service skills that I learned there have really served me well. And I think now looking back on my experience, it taught me that it doesn't have to be the perfect job. It's looking to build skill sets, and skill sets are transferable. So after working for several years in hospitality, I decided to try to get a job in what I was really passionate about, which was government and foreign policy, working in international relations. I went back to my internship employer, the International Relations Office, just to ask for a recommendation, start to network again, and they happened to have a position available. So it was serendipitous. It was entry level, but I worked hard to advance in my career and have been lucky to work for a long time in something that I love, which is working to connect policymakers all over the globe and allow them to share best practices and information sharing. So I'm working mostly in protocol and meeting planning, more so than specifically policy, but it definitely is in that realm of government. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Shannon. I think some key takeaways there are really to highlight the networking and how important that part of it is, as well as internships. I did the same thing, a couple of internships during my undergrad, and those are incredibly valuable for my career path, but also Erik's point about the sometimes unreasonably long process it takes to get these jobs in government. So noting that it is a long path to get to sometimes that position that you want, but just kind of being persistent and being prepared and sticking with it. So I'm going to go to the next question. We're going to start with Erik on that one. How would you describe the culture within the public service sector or your current organization? And for those who have worked in other fields, how would you compare and contrast?
Where I am in law enforcement, the culture is definitely one of results and action oriented. There's this expectation that we will work independently to support investigations and successful prosecutions civilly and criminally. More broadly speaking, the culture of working in an OIG, an Office of Inspector General, it definitely aligns with our mission of being an oversight agency and a watchdog agency. Generally speaking, a lot of us tend to look at the world and we see loopholes. We see the vulnerabilities in different programs and systems, and we see people behaving suspiciously. Just as important, we as a culture at OIG make suggestions and recommendations on how to mitigate those risks and those problems. And this is also to say that, while unique and distinct culture where I am, it's definitely not the dominant culture in federal government. Case in point, I work in law enforcement, but broader HHS is primarily a health care agency, a social service agency. And as I work with my colleagues in the different divisions of HHS, the program people, that becomes abundantly clear that contrast is definitely there. And that's not to denigrate anyone or their culture. It's rather to point out that the culture of the federal government is not this monolithic thing. There are distinct groups, and there's really a lot of variety across agencies.
Great, thanks, Erik. And Shannon.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think I would say that within public service and certainly within the legislature and legislative work, there is a culture of people being very passionate about what they do. Most people came into it for a certain reason, kind of how you were talking about your path. They really care about a particular public policy area, be it education or the environment. They care about the greater good, maybe poverty, jobs, health, or they care about serving constituents and trying to help citizens navigate government. So I've really found that the people, I think, who work in government, and sometimes they can get a bad rap, particularly civil service. However, I've found government workers, and I know from my legislative experience, to be very hard workers and very passionate people, especially compared with my private sector work, working in the hospitality industry. I think there can be enthusiasm for your job, but it's different when you have a sense of purpose.
That's great, thank you. And Edgar.
Great question. I would say for me, right, as Erik said, it's not a monolith. I work in the district within the legislature. So as opposed to policy, we deal a lot with community and trying to direct some of those resources from Sacramento to the district. So that requires a lot of community outreach as well, right? And a big part of it is because you do represent an elected to get her name out there, right? as well as making sure that these services are provided. That requires a lot of trust and a lot of open communication between you and your coworkers to make sure that everything gets executed. One big thing is because you do work for elected, you deal with a lot of egos. You know, I work with a senator. If she doesn't get along with a specific mayor or councilman or whoever, whichever other decision maker, I have to make sure that those relationships stay intact because we have to ensure that those resources do go to the constituents and the residents. So there's a fine line that you also have to play as a staffer. And also within cross sectors between for example, the private and the private and public sector. I would say the public sector is a little more ahead of its time because you are interacting with everyone. You know, ethics, you have to take ethics trainings, sexual harassment trainings. These are trainings that have been instituted for quite a bit, where the private sector might barely be catching up. And where the private sector deals with maybe a specific client or a specific group of people, in the private sector, you're dealing with everyone. So you have to really be open-minded as well, because you will come across groups or people that you haven't with before. So patience as well as being open-minded is very crucial to the culture.
Great insight there. Okay, so we have our next question. We're going to start with Shannon, and that is about the recruitment process. So what is the recruitment process like within your sector or organization? And what should interested candidates in your line of work do to put their best foot forward?
I think in the legislature, I would say it isn't so much recruitment per se. I do think in a way with the legislature, you have to be proactive and have to seek out opportunities. The legislature doesn't recruit in the same way, you know, a private company would at job fairs or things like that. So there's definitely initiative needed when you're going to be seeking a job at the legislature. However, there are a lot of resources and opportunities to try to become involved. The Senate and Assembly do have websites that list job openings. There are, of course, always the internships available with different members' offices, but that often does, unless you can go through a school program, that often involves pounding the pavement. And then there's also professional programs to get into the legislature and the executive, actually, and the judiciary. There's a fellowship program through Sacramento State University. That's a one-year fellowship working in government. There are science fellowships through the California Council on Science and Technology that bring in people who specialize in science into the legislature to give that expertise in policy. And of course, a huge way into politics in the legislature is working on campaigns and volunteering your time. So I think really one of the biggest things I would say in putting your best foot forward would be just having that initiative. And as you said earlier, being persistent and knowing that sometimes, you know, it's not a linear path and it can be a long path.
Great, thanks for that. Edgar.
Yeah, so a lot of this really overlaps with some of what Shannon said, being in the state Senate. On the district side, internships are very crucial. I can say that for myself, a lot of my colleagues, even within other offices, they started with internships within legislative offices. And that really because, you know, depending on turnover, you might be able to fill a certain office position, right? Depending how long you are, and because, you know, because you do have the insight, they don't have to train you, and you're already embedded within the culture. So internship and having that initiative is key. So for us within our office, that's how we've recruited some of our current staff, some of our interns. They've transitioned from being interns to here to the office as well. But they also have to go through the process, right? They have to get interviewed. They have to go through HR, Senate rules, and they have to make sure that the senator also they have a good connection and they can prove themselves to her as well. But yeah, these positions travel by very fast. They are posted on the Senate and Assembly websites. Usually, we don't have to do any outreach. For every position that opens, we receive dozens per week. So we don't really have to do much in terms of doing outreach. The hard part is choosing. So that's pretty much kind of how we do it in here at the district level.
Thanks, Edgar. And Erik, anything you have to add?
Yes, I would echo a lot of what my fellow panelists had said about having to be proactive about it, having to seek out the opportunity and actually apply. Your gateway to the federal civil service is most likely going to be the usajobs.gov website. A great many jobs are posted there, as well as the specific instructions for how to apply. Certain agencies and for certain positions may have a more direct process to apply, and for those, I would recommend that you seek out their respective websites for that. Now, as to how to make yourself a more competitive candidate, for those that are still in school, I'll reiterate what everyone else has said, is internships are definitely the way to go. Besides the networking, it will allow you or enable you to impress upon a hiring manager that at a bare minimum, you have a baseline understanding of what it's like to work in civil service, of the expectations. So I definitely recommend you take advantage of those whenever you can. For those of you that are currently working professionals, I would point you towards your written communication skills. In the federal government, the written word is king. Agencies exist and operate because of legislation, because of written rules and regs, policies and procedures. And there's a pretty good chance that in a federal position, written work product will be required of you. Formal reports are kind of the thing that comes top to mind. So to the extent that you can hone those skills now, do so. Additionally, be prepared to highlight your skills, your expertise and experience in formal written communication when you apply and interview with a job.
Thanks, Erik. And I appreciate that each of you brought in sort of slightly different things, and that every one of your positions has in common is that it's a public process, right? So the agendas, the topics, the things that each of your areas are working in is public, right? So if folks wanted to learn more about, things happening at the federal, state, and local level, everything's published because that's a requirement. So getting to know kind of what's on those agendas, who's, initiating items, who's kind of bringing forth various ideas is a way for folks to kind of find maybe their area of expertise or interest, or kind of get their foot in the door by being able to see all of the things that are put out there for the public to interact with. So we're just about to move into, we have a couple more questions before we're going to get to your questions. And I see that folks are already putting them in the Q&A. We have about 10 questions in there, but you still have time to add some more. We're going to try to get to as many of those as possible. And we have a couple more questions for our panelists before we get into that. So we're going to start with Edgar for our next question. And that is, can you share what opportunities are available to work in government and policy at the local level within cities and counties?
Yeah, so there's plenty of opportunities available within cities, counties, right? These agencies are always looking for analysts, policy experts. Legislative officers are looking for representatives, communications directors, chiefs of staffs, field representatives. Even within the counties and the cities, they have their own specific agencies within themselves. You have utilities, you have emergency services, very different agencies that deal with different aspects of serving the public. So there's quite a in my experience working for Riverside County in the city of Banning. There's departments that I wouldn't even within my experience I wouldn't. There's diversity, right? There's variety, and so having a degree definitely is important, right? Being an alumni of the UC Poli-Sci was very helpful for me, but you don't even have to be majored in political science or humanities. For example, my district director was a mechanical engineering, but he has served his entire career with electeds and within this legislature. So a lot of it, it's incumbent on relationships, going back to relationships, internships, and even if you don't know how to be, a lot of these positions are very open, they're very transparent because they are public offices. So they are very available to you, right? Electeds, city officials are always at events, having that initiative to meet with them, establishing that face-to-face contact so they remember you. And developing that relationship over time will definitely get you recommendations. And down the road, someone will recommend you or someone will remember you when it comes to a position, because positions, it's a revolving door, right? They're always popping up. So those are the type of opportunities that exist. And also here within the Inland Empire, you have certain regional government agencies such as the Southern California Association of Governments, Western Riverside Council of Governments. So there's plenty of opportunities that one, especially if you're a UC student or alumni, that you can tap into.
And Edgar, would you say also commissions and committees, boards, both at the city and the county, and actually in some circumstances, the state level is a good way to get your foot in the door?
Exactly. And that's also a lot of it in my experience, depending on relationships as well.
Yeah.
That will get you considered. And that's very important to develop experience, but also to have a deep impact.
Yeah, great. And I think Shannon mentioned earlier the importance of transferable skills. So you don't necessarily have to have the degree that matches the role, but you have built skills as a professional that are applicable in a lot of roles.
Exactly.
Great, thank you for that. All right, Erik, you get the next question, and that is, do you have any additional insights into applying for federal jobs, particularly law enforcement?
Yes, during the application process or the interviews, you may face some very specific and technical type of questions. And I'll give an example, a hypothetical from the law enforcement perspective. You may get a question such as, describe for us your experience with working with financial laws and regulations, such as the Anti-Money Laundering Act or statute. And when you get a question like that, it can be very frustrating, especially if you're trying to break into a new field, especially coming from the private sector into a government sector. And so ultimately, you have to answer honestly. If you don't have the experience, you need to disclose that. However, if that's the case, don't just stop there. Look at that question from another perspective. What it also is asking you is, have you any experience where you've had to work with, interpret, and apply complex rules and regulations in a work environment? And if you think of the question like that, you very well may have experiences that you can draw on and highlight. So you can parlay that question. While I don't have specific experience with financial law and regulation, I do have experience working with complex rules, et cetera, et cetera. So don't just stop and answer no. Think, okay, now how do I draw in my previous experience that has the underlying skill set, but it's just in a different subject matter. And one other thing to consider when you apply for federal positions, and not just law enforcement, is they frequently require a security clearance. And that, depending on the clearance, the job, the position, usually entails a pretty substantive background investigation that not only happens initially, but several times throughout your career. So just keep that in mind when you apply for those jobs.
Great advice. Okay, and the last question is for Shannon. Can you share how to work in international relations in public service at the state and federal levels?
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, I would say that the opportunities for international relations work at the state level are definitely more limited in public service because of the nature of the purviews between the state and federal governments. So there are opportunities working in the legislature. Obviously, the office that I work in, the assembly has a similar office. The governor's office also has staff that works on international relations. Many of the agencies, particularly agencies that have an issue that's global, like the environment, they may have staff that works on international relations. But it definitely is can be a challenge to get into those positions, and often does, as I said, just hinge on trying to get a foot in the door in those different institutions. There obviously is a lot more opportunity in public service, in government service, and public policy at the federal level, becoming a foreign service officer, working for the Congress, the administration. Again, these are political jobs, appointed positions often. So it can be just a process of trying to get into the institution and working to where you want to be, whatever committee or particular issue that you want to work on. But there is also a lot at the federal level where you're working on policy, but not necessarily with the government, different NGOs and think tanks. There's actually a website that's great for people who are interested in international relations, interested in global work, and it's globaljobs.org. I can put it in the chat. I would encourage anyone who's interested in the field to look at that website.
Great, thank you, Shannon, and thank you to all of you. That was really useful, I think applicable feedback. Now we are going to go into questions from the folks who are here with us today. We have a lot of them coming in Q&A. And some of them are directed, but these first ones are kind of general. So I'll just let you jump in, whoever wants to answer first. And of course, panelists, if you don't have anything to add, you don't have to. But our first question is from Kishore. What are some of the challenges and tips for folks moving from tech or private sector into government jobs?
I think, when you're looking to move from tech or the private sector into government jobs, a lot that we have already said is really applicable. Just that to know that it's a long path. For instance, into civil service at the state level or at the federal level is a process of examinations and interviews. I know, for instance, the Foreign Service Officer application process and employment process is almost a year long, just to go through all of the interviews and, as Erik was saying, background checks and different things like that. So I think just really being persistent, and then also just really looking for those skills that are transferable. Certainly in tech, there's a lot at the state level with the Government Operations Agency. Many different agencies, have their own tech people. The legislature has our own tech people, working to build software that's specific to legislative functions. So there's a lot available, I think, once you seek it out.
Great. Thank you. And a follow-up question to that is, how about pathways, this is from Gary, for large corporate senior executives interested in pivoting away from the private sector to give back via public service? I don't know if there's a same answer, Shannon, or if there's additions that anybody wants to add.
I would just jump in and say that I think if you're looking at very high-level executive positions, those are usually going to be appointed positions. So they're political jobs. I would think that the way to move into those kinds of things is, get involved with the parties, Democratic and Republican Party, whichever way you're going, attend events, get to know, as Edgar was saying, elected officials, get to know elected officials. And that is a way to be, to work into those kinds of senior advisor type roles.
Yeah, great advice. Okay, the next question is specifically for Erik. Do you have, and this is from Hugo, do you have a law degree? Did you have to pass a physical exam for your current role?
Hello, Hugo. I do not have a law degree, although some federal agents do have advanced degrees, law degrees, CPA certifications. As far as physical requirements, yes, before I could join the agency, I did have to partake in a physical examination to make sure that I could handle the rigors of it. And if you're healthy and in shape, it shouldn't be a problem. You do go to a law enforcement academy depending on your agency, but the vast majority of them go through the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia, is where I went along with many other agents, and that's where you get all your training, and to include legal training as it applies to law enforcement.
Great, thanks for that. All right, the next question is for Edgar from Josephine. You mentioned that you earned your master's in public policy from UCR. Based on your experience and what you've seen from your colleagues, would you say your MPP was an essential component to advancing your career? Oops. And let's see, sorry, the chat moved. How exactly did it benefit you?
Yeah, so when I did my master's in public policy, I specifically focused my research in water, which I am not now, but definitely a lot of the instruments and policy skills definitely help when analyzing some of the legislation coming in. A lot of constituents, a lot of groups, they come and ask for interpretations or how exactly is the bill going to affect their organization or their community. So going through the technicalities really did, my degree really did help in assessing some of those technicalities, which, and that was seen through the interview process and when I was hired in. So I would say that was one of the huge parts of how my degree helped as well, aside from building those relationships.
Yeah, and I think with Edgar, a lot of what you talked about, and Shannon to a certain extent too, some levels of government are more, you have to be sort of more of a generalist. So it's good to have a specialty, but you also have to be able to kind of move back and forth between, the environment and public works and parks and rec and open spaces, and then also know a little bit about law enforcement and emergency response, right? And so there's a lot of things. I mean, Erik is in its sort of more specialty area, but even still, relationships and partnerships matter. So kind of having an idea about kind of where your interest lies, but also being able to know enough to know how to partner with and build relationships across specialties, I think is also important. Okay, let's see. So the next one is a question from Ava for any panelist. With regard to career ladders, is it easy to jump out of civil service to pursue a full-time advanced degree program and then jump back in after the program is completed? Good question.
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that specifically because I haven't worked in civil service. However, I do know that once you've gotten into civil service, I think that my understanding is that it's easier to get back in because you've already taken the exams, etc. But a great place probably to find out that information would be like on the calcareers.org website, or EDD also has a website about how to get a state job. Those sites might have answers to those types of questions, or have chat features where you can ask those types of questions.
I can also chime in on that. I think it's going to be very dependent on your specific situation, your agency, and your position. So I don't think there's any one standard answer to that. Just some things to consider. Frequently in civil service, an agency, an office, a region is allotted a number of positions. They call them full-time equivalents, FTEs. If you depart for whatever reason, to pursue a master's degree or something else, that FTE may not stay and be reserved for you to return. So there is a chance that if you leave, you may have to reapply for your old job or for a similar position. But that being said, potentially you now have an advanced degree and something to bring to the table, as well as previous experience in the government, maybe even in your same agency. So there's no one solid answer, but it's going to be very specific as to your situation.
I think it's good feedback, Erik, because one of the big things that you'll hear, I come from social services, I'm a social worker. We don't go into it for the money. A lot of us end up working in nonprofits, but a lot of us also work in government. And one of the key reasons people move to government, county usually, is because of the benefits. So if you start and stop your employment, that impacts the benefits that you get because it's based on length of service, basically years of service. So it's something to think about in terms of like long-term planning. But I know when I was a county employee, I got my master's degree while I worked there. It's a hustle because you got a full-time job and you've also got, you know, your graduate school, but it's possible. And I had a lot of peers and colleagues who did the same thing. So sort of depending on what you're looking at, and now in this kind of more virtual friendly world, it is actually in a lot of ways possible to get your degree while you're working. It's just a lot of work. Okay, so this next question is for either Edgar or me, and I'll give Edgar a stab at it first. If I consider to run for office, what do I do first? Make appearances, meet the community?
Yeah, I always meet community first. You know, that's how you build a base if you want to run, right? When considering strategy and who you consider your base when, you know, when targeting voters. But it always has to be with wanting to serve, right? If you don't have a heart for service, you're not going to last very long. So definitely meeting with community folks, you know, years prior, I would say, or even, you know, depending how soon you want to run, months ahead. It's always important to know who are the key players within your city or jurisdiction, and those that align with your values as well, because that's going to be important because those are the ones that are going to support you. But in the end, it always goes back to service. You have to have a heart for it.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think what's a lot of times people who are motivated to run are motivated for a very specific issue or something that's happening in their community. And I think that's great. Anything that inspires us to be elected officials and be public servants is great. And you're never going to just be elected to do that one thing, right? So it is really about learning about your community, learning how it works. I would say definitely getting involved in and getting appointed to commissions, committees, boards, even if they're not exactly what you want to do, learning the Brown Act, learning how public meetings run, getting comfortable with having, you know, what many cases is being on live television, having debates. It's not as comfortable as it might seem. It's actually a very awkward way to have conversations and make decisions. But meeting with, you know, elected officials that you admire, also meeting with ones that you maybe disagree with, so you can hear and learn about their politics. You're going to have to serve with people whose politics don't align with yours. And so how do you work through that? How do you make decisions? So I think there's basically getting to know your community, getting appointed to, or even just volunteering to be on boards, commissions, committees, so that you can both learn the issues and also learn the processes. And then also know that running for office is very different than serving. So different skill sets. And I'm sure both Edgar and I are happy to talk to anybody who's considering elected office. After this, we're both reachable. And so we're happy to talk to you. Okay, the next question is from Ross for Edgar or Shannon. How can someone support policy making in a less formal way, i.e. provide support and expertise on specific issues to shape new policies that need to be made, but not necessarily be seeking employment? That's a great question.
Yeah, I would say, you know, always meeting with your local representative or a specific representative if you're looking at a specific issue like education or environment, right? A lot of these elected serve in different committees, for example, in the Senate. So if your passion is education and you have a certain expertise, always meeting with people in the district or within the Capitol. Right now, it's easier with Zoom, right? You don't have to travel all the way to Sacramento to meet with the Capitol staff. You know, in a sense, the pandemic kind of changed things for the better in that aspect. Offering that expertise, or if you belong to a certain organization, if you have the language, you can sponsor, right? You can sponsor a certain bill, and that's certain. That's some of the ways that you can help in a less formal sense, but still make a deep impact.
Yeah, and I would just add on to what Edgar said at the end, definitely getting involved with community organizations or advocacy organizations who are working on behalf of particular issues of interest to you. Because as Edgar said, a lot of the policy that's made in the Capitol, the ideas come from outside groups who come to a legislator and say, I mean, they're the ones who are, immersed in the issue. They often know what needs to be done, whether it's in whatever education, as he said, or health or the environment. So really getting involved with advocacy organizations, nonprofits at your local level who are working on issues and bringing them forward to the legislature.
Yeah, and one more thing to add to that is, making public comment, all right, or calling your representatives. If you have tracking certain legislation, right, we always have to log everything that comes in, and that always goes back to the Capitol staff and to the senator. So making public comment, right, you can go to Sacramento or contact your local legislative offices, and always and you're always available to call them anytime. So that's also one way that people make a huge impact.
I'm glad you said that, Edgar. I was going to add that particularly at the local level, depending on how politically active your community is, but oral communications and public comment, which are a requirement of public meetings, is heavily influenced by the feedback from communities. And same with your district offices for state and federal, that's going directly to the representative. So a lot of people don't do it. You sometimes hear the same voices over and over and over and over. So if you want your voice to be heard, that's a key way to do it. Okay, this question is from Catherine. To any panelists, some government jobs have age requirements. What would you suggest for those over age 55?
Hi, I'll take a stab at that one. And you're right, some jobs do have age requirements, but many do not. So I think the biggest thing to consider, and I don't want to give advice, especially retirement advice and whatnot, but just something to consider when you apply for federal service, when you're a mid-career professional, is you may not be able to realize all of the federal benefits for retirement due to the fact that you are probably unable to serve the requisite time to reach all those benefits. And that's, again, it's going to vary on your situation, so I don't want to get too specific. But as a candidate, I would think that you would be a strong candidate. You probably bring a lot of experience and training to the table. So I wouldn't let that discourage you. Just be mindful of the pension system and the ability to take advantage of it.
Great feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I could add to that as well, I've had colleagues as well in other offices, legislative offices, where some do that are over 55 work part-time because they have a personal relationship or they've known the elected in the past, and they still serve as a part-time field representative and work on the specific issues that they care about, right? Whether it's veterans or different types of issues. That's also available as well. So those opportunities do exist.
Great. This next question is for all panelists. How is the day-to-day work like for each of you? And do you usually stay in your office? Is there required travel? What is the work-life balance? And I'm sure this was impacted by COVID, so maybe differentiating between kind of pre and post-COVID. Whoever wants to go first.
I'd say for us, before COVID, it always varies from day to day. You have in-person meetings at the office, or you have outside meetings, either through lunch or you're meeting a specific agency, whether it's the city, the county, or if you're meeting with an organization. Sometimes you have grand openings, or you're presenting, certificates of recognition to certain community members. You're always out and about, and then or you're in the office, depending, working on constituent casework, catching up on emails. It varies from day to day, or you're, creating events for the senator, right? Preparing coffees, community events. It's always different from day to day, but that's usually kind of what it constitutes.
Yeah, I would just echo Edgar and say that that's probably one of the reasons why I've been able to stay with the same office for 23 years, is that I feel like legislative work is different every day. And you're always getting the opportunity to learn about a new issue, a new policy area, a new problem that people are facing in the community. So that is one of the great things about legislative work, is that you do have really a variety. And pre-COVID was in the office part-time, but out at the Capitol meeting with international visitors who are coming to the Capitol, accompanying them to their meetings, and etc. Of course, now everything has transitioned online, and that was a big transition, certainly for our office, and I think for most people in the legislative arena, because it is such public-facing work. And it's so important, the relationships, I think, Cynthia, as you said, and Edgar, relationships are so important. So that people-to-people contact has, shifted during COVID. And I think that's been a challenge for a lot of people in the legislative area.
And I would add, in my position, the day-to-day is actually what I really like about the job. There's a lot of variety. As case agents, we have a lot of discretion in how we conduct our investigations. Of course, we have partners that we work with, prosecutors we work with, and so it's not entirely on your own, but your day-to-day can frequently be up to you, whether you want to go out and do field work like interviews, or you need to write reports or review documents. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility. Travel does happen. It's definitely part of the job, and many positions will notify you up front in the application process that a certain amount of travel can be expected. So they do notify you up front. And like everyone said, COVID has impacted things. My agency afforded many flexibilities to utilize technology to take advantage of working remotely when we can, and other institutions have been impacted that we partner with, whether it's the court systems and having hearings, whether to the extent that those transferred over to Zoom-like features, and some of our partner agencies we utilize virtual teleconferences as opposed to going down to the U.S. Attorney's Office to meet with the prosecutor. But overall, and touching, I think the last question was about work-life balance, and that's always a challenge. I don't think that's unique to any one job. You just have to find your ways to balance that in your life.
I'm glad you addressed that, because that's the big question. Okay, this is going to be, I think, our last question before we have closing remarks, and that is, are you able to actually impact policy, share views, and build new practices policies, or is government policy work more doing what you're told? AKA, are you at the table? And this question's from Victor. It's a great question. Who wants to start?
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard the phrase personnel is policy. So if you're a certain elected, you do bring in the people that align with your values and who are going to shape the policy that fits with you, right? And so you are a reflection of who the elected is, and whether it's whatever type of legislation you're dealing with, you are going to have your fingerprint on it. So I think that's the big way that that policy is affected, by staff everywhere, right, in the state and local government at the federal level. So yes, yeah, you do have a big impact.
Shannon or Erik?
I would just, confirm everything that Edgar said. I think staff absolutely has a tremendous impact on policy, on the discussions that take place. They're maybe not voting on the floor, but they are behind the scenes working on the policy and the bills every day. So yeah, tremendous impact.
And I'll just say, progress is slow, bureaucracy is slow. It is, the public process is great because it allows for public access, but it means that it takes more time to hear the feedback and process the feedback and research the feedback and then respond to it, right? So things don't move quickly. So sometimes it feels like you're not having an impact, but you just kind of got to stick with the process to be able to see things through. I think that's probably one of the things that feels most frustrating from sort of the outside, is that it seems like things aren't advancing. It just takes time. Okay, so before we do our closing remarks, I want to open it up, and we'll start with Erik to see if there's any final pieces of feedback you'd like to offer to our audience today.
Yes. For those of you that are considering a career in the civil service, I encourage you to strongly consider it. If you're interested, go ahead and apply. And for those that are looking for a career in law enforcement, I would encourage you to branch out your search, widen it out, and don't necessarily stick to some of the bigger named agencies. There actually are a tremendous amount of federal law enforcement positions, whether they're a patrol uniform type work or investigations. And you may be surprised to see how many there are out there. I will encourage you to look at the IG community. They have some interesting and unique work, and you may find yourself a niche. Good luck to you, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Erik. Shannon.
I would just my final thoughts with legislative work would be to have patience and perseverance, as you were saying. I think I know a lot of my friends in policy work and legislative work and government, sometimes we say it feels like, one step forward, 2 steps back. And I'm sure that it can feel that way sometimes in your job search as well. But just patience, persistence, and truly pursuing something that is of interest to you and that you love. If you do that, that's the most important thing.
Thanks, Shannon. And Edgar.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, relationships are big in this field. If you have a certain passion for certain policies, certain issues, and I think as long as that's firm, I think, and you have the relationship, the rest will follow. So that's what I encourage a lot of you, especially the younger young professionals. We mentioned earlier internships. That's one way to build relationships, but also volunteering. And if you do have a specific policy, if you're in school, pursue those type of policy programs that do give you some of the schools, and you will have that knowledge once you go into the industry. So that's what I recommend. With some of you mentioned running for office, that applies as well. Relationships and having some being interested in policy as well and keeping track of it. That'll be huge.
Great, excellent advice. Thank you so much. On behalf of the University of California, thank you for joining us today for our UC Alumni Career Network webinar. It was a pleasure to connect virtually with each of you today. We appreciate you making time to be a part of today's event and hope you've gained valuable advice on working in government policy and public service. I'd like to thank Edgar, Erik, and Shannon for their time, their generosity, and commitment to the University of California. The insights and advice you each shared today make me especially proud to be part of the UC community. I hope you will take a few minutes to provide feedback on today's event by following the survey link which appeared in your browser when you launched today's webinar. The feedback you provide will help improve this series and help the organizers select topics for upcoming sessions. We hope you will join us on August 17th for our next UC Alumni Career Network webinar focused on parenting and work. Please visit ucal.us/ACN for details. If you would like to contact me or our panelists, please email alumni@ucop.edu to request our contact information. I know that we are all open to hearing from you. And thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.